This is called The Turning Light. Charles Henry Parker had killed 4 men and a woman in his long life. He told the sordid story to his grandson, Flipper Morris, his late daughter's only child. The conversation took place on the porch of the Everest Senior Home on the outskirts of El Cajon in 1951. The first kill was a gunslinger he'd shot from behind when he was 19. Charles asked Flipper how old he was. Flipper said 20. Charles just grunted. It had been in Yuma in a dusty street while the afternoon light merged with the weather front, and the eastbound train whistled out of the station. Charles rode away through the lengthening shadows of tall saguaro. The second was an Apache outside a saloon in Flagstaff who had been too drunk to stop fighting. Charles asked his grandson had he ever been to that region. Flipper said no. Charles said, "You don't get around much, do you?" There had been no common language to signal surrender, and Charles had to choke the Indian into submission. The woman was the Apache's squaw. After seeing her man lying dead and Charles crawling away, she came screaming after him with a shepherd's staff. Charles stabbed her with her husband's shearing knife. She more or less had fallen on the blade, wanting to live just a little less than Charles did. Charles asked Flipper, had he ever killed a woman? Flipper said, "Of course not, Grandpa." Charles asked if he'd ever had one. Flipper just lit up a lucky. Charles said, "You're young yet." Charles went on that he didn't care much about living or dying in those days, but had always come out on top. He'd vacated Arizona for good after that and had come on to California. The next was a Chinaman, and it happened in a bar brawl in old San Diego. Charles cracked him on the temple with a beer mug that didn't shatter, actually trying to restore order. The man hit the floor and never moved again. Charles remembered he had a pigtail. Nobody seemed to care. It was a port town. Flipper asked him the name of the place. Charles said, "The Bar Pilot." "Know it?" Flipper said he'd been there. Charles wondered whether to believe him. The last one Charles wouldn't talk about, said what good would come of it. Nothing he could think of. He'd done 11 years at Lompoc for it and was almost 80 when he got out. 83 this very day, Flipper thought, and he sits there in the shade at a rest home drinking iced tea, seeing parole every quarter, 5 guilty souls in the ground. That last one, Flipper knew, had been Flipper's father, who had brutalized Flipper's mother. She had the restraining order, but he found her anyway at her father's. He was sorry, then crazy sorry, then just crazy. Charles winged him in the driveway, then followed him 4 blocks to finish it. It was the 4 blocks that convinced the jury. Flipper had been in kindergarten. He thought he remembered the gunshot. He liked to think he came from a long line of desperados. He believed it because he considered himself a coward, a fearful man, spooked by the world he walked through. Charles told him that he was not a brave man either, far from it. Told him that it was the fear that caused him to do despicable things. Courage wasn't a part of the deal until later. It was courage when you allowed yourself to forget it and move on. Then Charles asked Flipper to remind him where he got the nickname. Seemed kind of lame on a grown man. Flipper looked across the desert floor and watched the way the setting light played through the yucca trees. Finally said his mother started calling him that when he was young. Charles said she'd been a good woman, then mentioned his own mother, said she'd been a good woman too. She died when Charles was a boy in Ohio. Both men considered their mothers, their thoughts separate, their silence shared. He heard the ice tinkling in his grandfather's glass. It was in that moment he began thinking of himself as Phil again. Philip. It was a name with courage in it. Phil, a brave name. The valley floor darkened as he looked across it. The yuccas disappearing in haze like signposts in time.